I'm here today to discuss an idea that might challenge some of our deepest assumptions about identity, that language more than race determines who we are. Each of us has been compelled to ask ourselves this question: who am I? When you see me, you see a Black woman. What assumptions are made about me based on my physical appearance? And how does language influence my lived experience, my identity, and even my place in society? How does it influence yours? We will get to all of that, but first, please come with me as I briefly share my immigrant experience and tell you about why, now that I live in South Africa, I am so interested in the topic of language. So I don't know if it's obvious, but I ain't from George. My family and I are often asked why we would choose to leave America for South Africa, as though it's the worst decision my husband and I could have made for our young family. It's true that there are many benefits to living in the USA, but there are some drawbacks. For example, this was the view from my living room in Atlanta, and this was the view from my living room when we lived in Plett. So, there are only slight differences between the two. I don't mean to make light because, yes, of course, it was difficult to leave the family, friends, and relationships that we had spent years building in Atlanta. But we found that our new community in Plett was encouraging, eager to know us, and welcoming and to embrace us. One of the first relationships that I made in Plett was with Roxana. She's an older woman of Indian descent. And she showed me how the very bougie city we had moved to was a reflection of South Africa at large. It was also she who introduced me to this concept that I'll be talking to you about today. She said, in South Africa, identity is more determined by language than race. I was absolutely fascinated because in America, we see identity in very flat racial terms, largely. In fact, for years, our official forms had race categorized as white or Caucasian, Negro or Black, Latino or Hispanic, Indian, Asian, or other. Each of these terms was more offensive than the next. I had a multiracial friend of mine express to me her distress and disgust at having to choose the term other to categorize her humanity. You see, I had had the privilege of never having to think about this. I was just Black. In America, everybody is a hyphenated American. You're a Black American, you're a Native American, you're an Asian American, you're a real American. Nevertheless, the majority of us speak American English, which identifies us as Americans. In South Africa, you're not just Black or white, you're Zulu or Xhosa, you're English or Afrikaans. And so language becomes a key marker of identity and can be a powerful tool for both inclusion and exclusion. Language and the written word are the lifeblood of my work as an author and blogger. In a university course, we briefly discussed the origins of language. You may all be familiar with the parable of the Tower of Babel. This is where God put a hard brake on the construction of the world's first skyscraper by disrupting the communications flow. The human race, once united by a single language, now found themselves in an utter state of confusion with the introduction of many different languages. And so they abandoned the project, grouped themselves together by common tongue, and moved to other parts of the globe. Now, there are other theories to explain the diversity of human communication, but this happens to be my favorite because of the dramatic flair. Mind you, Afrikaans, one of South Africa's 11 official languages, had not been invented at this time. As I mentioned, I am a storyteller who works with words. I also work with a variety of people who speak many different languages. So you can imagine my shock and surprise when I received an angry email from a reader who was furious that we had platformed an Afrikaans-speaking colored woman on our blog. Now, I confess I understand the reader's angst, even though I don't share it. At only 100 years old, Afrikaans may be the youngest language in the world officially, but what it lacks in longevity, it has certainly made up for in controversy. I don't think there is a language that has had as much bad PR as Afrikaans. Often associated with oppression during apartheid, it has been described in some of the harshest terms. Nevertheless, it is fiercely defended by its native speakers as a vital part of their identity. It has been described as the language of the oppressor. It's been described as a violent language. Charlize Theron called it a dying language. No matter what your feelings are about Afrikaans, there is no denying that it is an interesting masala of a language that draws literal references from the lived experiences of its many diverse contributors. Take, for example, one of my favorite words in Afrikaans, kameelperd. In English, this is a giraffe, but the literal translation is a camel horse. Go ahead and let that image sit with you for a little bit. The reality is that language in itself is neither oppressive, nor kind, nor uplifting, nor violent, but it is a powerful tool that can be used to oppress, to uplift, to show kindness, and to also be violent with. And as we all know, language is much more than that. Rita Mae Brown, a feminist writer, said that language is the roadmap of a culture. It tells you where its people come from and where they are going. The first time I encountered the idea of using language to identify belonging in a scholarly sense was in that same university course, and we were discussing the word shibboleth. A shibboleth is a Hebrew term meaning ear of corn or flood, and it was used in a biblical passage as a password to distinguish insiders from outsiders. Mispronouncing it had dire consequences. It would mean death, and it shows you that language in this instance was much more important in using for identification than racial concepts. This concept is not just limited to ancient history. It has applications in our modern times as well. With any imposing colonial force, one of the first strategies that is employed is to destroy native language, either through criminalization or forced adoption. And when this isn't possible, native languages are relegated to insignificance. For example, during the 1974 Soweto uprisings, the apartheid government faced fierce resistance when it attempted to impose Afrikaans as the medium of instruction. The use of Afrikaans had been declining amongst indigenous African populations because of its association with apartheid. For many years, Dutch and English were the only official languages, with Afrikaans eventually replacing Dutch entirely. The apartheid government did something very interesting. They used language as a tool for social engineering by creating a colored class. And these are people of mixed Khoisan, Asian, African, and European descent who mostly spoke Afrikaans and or English. These class divides were hard-coded through language by providing this particular group noticeably better housing, social services, and amenities. And while this practice is no longer in play today, the effects are still seen. The apartheid government is not the only regime to have used language as a tool for social engineering. The British have certainly had their time in the sun. I was once playing the Oppression Olympics with a friend of mine who said to me, and I quote, "There is no brutality that the English have not inflicted upon the world that they first did not perfect in Ireland." And that shut me down. I said, well, that's a pretty bold claim. And I said, well, let me look it up. And it turns out this particular friend was right. In 1367, the British government enacted Article 3 of the Statute of Kilkenny, which made it illegal for Irish speakers to speak their language with their British colonists, and for British colonists to do the same when interacting with their Irish subjects. The Laws and Wales Act of 1535 was stated that no one who was a monoglot Welsh speaker would be allowed to serve in public courts, barring them from being able to protect themselves, to defend themselves in court. The stated aim of this act was to extinguish the sinister traditions of the Welsh. Starting in the 1920s, in America, there was a huge push to unite the nation under the English language, and this led to South Louisiana children being punished in schools for speaking French. The result was that these children began to self-censor and not pass on French to their children and the next generation. The result had a huge consequence for their Creole culture. In Ghana, where I was born, Children were physically beaten and punished for speaking home languages on school grounds. The result is that today, like me, there are many middle-class children who cannot speak native language or can't speak it well. And if native language is the roadmap of a culture, and these children cannot speak native language, whose roadmap will they use? How will they lead a nation? How will they influence the nation? Interestingly, foreign language can also be a tool for revolution. In India, Dalits, who are considered the lowest caste, have their language stigmatized by fellow Indians, and they see mastering English as a tool and a way out of a lifetime of oppression and human rights abuses. In fact, Bimrao Abdikar, a social reformer, famously reflected on the English language, saying that those who drink the milk of the lioness become stronger. And this is also hard-coded in the worship of the goddess English in India. What you are looking at now are the results of my DNA test. You will see about the 1800s, an Irish person entered my chat, and so now you can forgive me for my very bad Irish accent earlier. I stand before you as a paradox of identity. My DNA shows mixed ancestry, but I'm classified as Black. I speak American English, which gives me certain privileges, but my skin color has and does limit my access to certain spaces. And this speaks to the duality and the complexity of identity based on both language and race. We've also seen this play out in pop culture recently with the experiences of two women who have made international headlines. Tyla, a South African woman who identifies as colored, was vilified in America for, quote, denying her Blackness. Meanwhile, here at home, Chidinma Adesina, a former Miss South African contestant of Nigerian and Mozambican descent, who was born and raised in the country and has only known South Africa as her home, had her identity stripped away from her by online trolls, members of the media, and even some government officials. And so these experiences encourage us to beg the question, what power structures and ideologies have the right to enforce an identity upon us based on how we speak? Nelson Mandela said that if you speak to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. And this statement highlights the profound impact that language can have on our connections with others, as well as the divinity of language. We have seen here previously examples of hierarchies of language. But why do these exist? The simple truth is that these are put in place to rank us as a human race from the most valuable to the least. They are a tool for division. My hope is for a world where my children and your children and those children afterwards can live in a globe where all languages and all identities are honored and respected. And I believe that if we go back to the marvel of what human language is as a technology and a human innovation, that this is possible. And so this week, I encourage you all to conduct a small experiment. Speak to someone in the language of their heart and see how it changes your interaction. Thank you.